Cuba, as a population that is not huge, it is not a great consumer of oil, but nevertheless, as a country, it does rely on oil for transport and quite a lot for the generation of electricity. And so President Trump's refusal to allow any oil to enter Cuba at all has had a dramatic effect on the Cuban economy. About 30% of its oil needs are met from its own oil wells, but there's not many of them, and it's not huge reserves. The rest has to be imported. And whilst they are rapidly transforming the electricity generation into solar and wind power, they still rely on oil. And so the denial of any oil supplies to Cuba has had a very, very damaging effect. They have reserves, strategic reserves, which are obviously being used up. They keep special reserves available for essential services like health, but for the majority of people, that means constant electricity blackouts. And I was there recently, and the blackouts can go on for as long as 14 hours in a day, which means that refrigeration obviously doesn't work any longer, and indeed food stored in freezer conditions then thaws out and is lost, and so on. There's been an attempt, now successful, for an oil tanker to get through. One has come from Russia recently, and that is now being offloaded in Matanzas and will be refined. It will provide enough oil for about 3 to 4 weeks. Clearly, Cuba will continue minimally using oil in order to preserve reserves. And I heard yesterday that the government of Mexico is also sending a tanker load of oil, which will be arriving within the next 3 weeks. So that means they've got around 6 to 8 weeks supply now there. It's still precarious, but some is getting through. I was part of a delegation that was delivering medical aid to Cuba. We took as much as we could as hand luggage, as passengers, as did people from all over the world that came there. There were over 30 nations represented in this delegation, and we all brought as much as we could. So, but again, that's nowhere near the overall requirements. In the case of Britain, Cuba Solidarity is sending a container load of medical equipment to Cuba, and Mexico has also sent a very large volume by sending a Mexican Navy ship there. But Cuba is alone, is isolated. It managed, as I said, to get some oil from Russia. The only country that's actually effectively able to help Cuba at the moment is Mexico, and they themselves are constantly threatened with increased tariffs and attacks by Trump for doing so. So the situation is serious. They are very isolated. Venezuelan oil no longer comes at all, and they were relying on Venezuelan oil for many years. And so, but the Cuban people are very well organized. The society is very well organized, and they are growing increasing amounts of their own food. There's huge amounts of vegetables growing all over the major towns and cities, as well as obviously in the rural areas. And with importation of solar equipment from China, they are gradually transforming the economy into a sustainable one. And I took part in a fascinating, very high-powered conference when I was there of government officials and those that work in the energy sector in Cuba, as well as international experts who were talking about how quickly they could transform, not just with solar and wind, but also battery storage of electricity, because the problem with electricity is, and until the relatively new massive battery facilities were developed in this country and in China and Germany, it was impossible to store electricity. All you could do was store what you make electricity with, so water in the case of hydro, or oil or coal in the case of thermal nuclear power. Well, the BRICS nations, of which Cuba is part, are coming together. Increasingly, there is an alternative alliance around the world. And the nations in the Global South, while all under threat through the Helms-Burton Act of trading with Cuba, are nevertheless doing their best to show solidarity. So Cuba might be politically isolated by the governments around the world who are frightened of the USA. Nevertheless, people are showing up in support. But I have a special word to the European Union. You trade with Cuba, you recognise Cuba, you say it shouldn't be isolated, you vote against the sanctions on Cuba ritually at the UN every year. Where's the aid? I was in Havana, and the people there are stoic, well organised, and essentially very creative, but they're also very frightened, because when you see on television Donald Trump announcing he's quite capable of bombing Cuba, yeah, he is. The US could very easily bomb Cuba. And Cuba, whilst it would do its best to defend itself, obviously, is not in a position to withstand the forces of bombardment by the US. And so there is fear there too.
Yeah, but I thought maybe just to get this, try and log in.
Jelajahi cara baru mendapatkan informasi. Download MetroTV Extend sekarang.